Senator! Senator Relkis, wake up! The humans have broken containment! Relkis sat bolt upright hearing this and saw his attendant Genro standing at the end of the bed. Genro was a small, round-bodied thing with 2 squat legs. Relkis had never seen him look anything other than bored, but at the moment, he seemed anxious. The Telnian's one large eye that dominated his round body was wide, and he was fiddling with the hem of his vest nervously.
"What do you mean, broken containment?"
Relkis asked incredulously. "I know nothing more of that, Senator, but an emergency meeting of the Senate has been called by the Emperor himself. I am to take you to the Great Armillary at once." Genro responded, sounding nervous.
"Very well. Await me outside while I dress,"
the senator commanded. The Telnian bowed his head and quickly ran out of the room, hastily closing the entryway's curtain flap on his way. After he had gone, Relkis sat up and swung his 4 legs to the side of the bed. He stretched his back and 4 arms upward. The small horns that extended from around the crown of his head dug into his arms as he did, but his red skin was far too thick for them to even scratch. Feeling more relaxed after his rude awakening, he stood and began to dress. He donned the long silky purple robes that marked him as a senator, and a silver circlet on his arm that bore his family crest. He was a Morlaw after all, and to his race, lineage was everything. Genro was waiting in the hallway, anxiously scratching at the floor with the 2 claws on his left foot. The small attendant turned and led the way through the large lavish estate. On either side of the hallway, doors to well-furnished rooms were open, showing the opulence with which the family estate was decorated. They passed a sitting room filled with ornate leather chairs around a fire pit, the library his grandfather had curated from among the settled systems, a trophy hall his uncle had filled with extremely rare kills from exotic hunts, and an armory housing weapons from a darker time, long, long ago, when war still existed. A darker time in which his family had built many of the weapons used. As they made it outside, Relkis turned his head upwards to look at the sky, still the deep purple and red of Morlanian night.
"What time is it, Genro?"
he inquired. "About half-night, sir. I'm sure none of the senators are pleased about being summoned at this time. Watch your step, sir," the Telnian replied, holding the door open to the sky skimmer he had waiting.
"Oh, for ancestors' sake, what could demand this from the Emperor?"
Relkis said, stepping into the skimmer and taking the passenger seat. "Not a clue, my lord, but we best make haste, for it's surely important," Genro said, running around the skimmer to jump into the driver's seat. He started its channel vacuums, the burst engines roared, and the sleek silver craft took to the skies. The flight over his lands always pleased him, but tonight there was a dark foreboding that seemed to hang over everything. Relkis hoped this was merely his own apprehension and not an omen of ill to come. Choosing to ignore such thoughts, he turned his gaze forward to see the great gates looming in the distance. The gates had been built a millennia ago. At the time, his species had just celebrated 500 years without war, and 200 years since they had mastered splitting the existential particle giving them limitless energy. That was when the scions of the imperial court had made contact with them telepathically. They gave them the instructions on how to build and power these great gates, which enabled travel between worlds. This was how every member species of the Empire had achieved travel beyond their own planets, so much so that it was law. Species must hit these benchmarks in this order and sustain them for these minimums before they can be considered. The humans had not done any of these. They had not even achieved peace amongst themselves. So what then could they have done to merit this meeting? Relkis's thoughts were interrupted by the sky skimmer touching down between the 2 gates. He knew one gate led to the Nexus, a nearly planet-sized facility that housed a portal to every member species world, as well as portals yet to be linked. He had almost never used it, only once when he had gone to visit another world as part of the political training required to serve in the court. The portal they were heading to, however, he used regularly. It leads straight to the seat of the Empire, the home of the psionic Solern species, and meeting place of the imperial court. Genro jumped from his seat and hurried around the skimmer to open Relkis's door for him with a slight bow. Relkis smiled. He didn't believe in servants, but those who volunteered for it often took it with the utmost seriousness. Genro's commitment to even enact this small eased the senator's anxious heart.
Well, we'd best not keep anyone waiting, my faithful attendant,
he said, exiting the vehicle and striding towards the portal. Genro closed the door and shuffled after him, keeping up well despite the size difference between them. When they had reached the threshold, they paused together and waited.
Are you prepared?
A whispery, wire-thin voice sounded in their minds.
We are,
Relkis replied aloud. A silver hand with 10 fingers and 2 thumbs reached through toward him. Another stretched towards Genro. In unison, the hands grasped them on the shoulders and pulled them in. Relkis felt his consciousness being pulled from his body, felt the ends of his body evaporate, felt the web of thought he had become be wrapped in a cocoon of mental energy from their psionic escort. He tried to forget the ugly truth of the gates, but it was impossible to once thinking about it. Traveling between worlds wasn't actually traveling per se. The gates were not teleporters, after all. These gates worked as amplifiers for the psionic signals, allowing a psion to mentally reach through infinite distance. They would use their abilities to pull your mind from your body and memorize the makeup of your body down to the last existence particle. Your body was then unmade on one side and remade on the other before your mind was shoved back inside. Traveling without a psion would result only in death. It was how peace had been kept, how the Empire maintained its power, cooperate, or be cut off and stranded. But it worked, and the Empire had been kind to all of its members, with none benefiting more than any other. Relkis felt his thoughts slow now, which meant the journey was nearly over, and then he felt them slam to a halt for a brief second before a breeze blew across his face. They had arrived, and he was back in his body. Relkis opened his eyes and bowed to the Solern scion who had assisted with their passage. Genro did the same, though much deeper. The Solern was a bit shorter than Relkis and much thinner. He had 3 red eyes, one set over the other in a line down the center of his triangular face. His long arms now hung at his sides and he was panting, slouching a bit on his 2 double-jointed legs. His silver skin shone with so much sweat he almost looked like he was made of liquid metal. Clearly, he had been hard at work. Pulling senators from the gate, all one after the other, was a lot of effort. The other Solern around them were in similar shape, with another team standing by to take in, should their fatigue become too much for them to safely pull minds across the void. Relkis stood from his bow and said,
We thank you for your effort, Mind Puller. Are we among the last?
Not even close. We still have half of the court to pull through. Don't worry about us. We've trained for this. His voice whispered in Relkis's mind, panting from the exertion.
Make sure not to overexert yourself, and to get plenty of rest and food after this. Thank you again, Mind Puller.
Relkis said, turning to walk down the massive hallway to the court chambers. This hallway was grand and opulent, as all buildings on the Empire's foundry, the capital world, were. It was lined with statues of each member's race's first senator, appearing in the order that they had joined. Those closer to the court hall were those that had joined earlier, and conversely, those closer to the gate were newer. There was still room in the hall for more species, should any join. About halfway down the line of statues on the right side, Relkis stopped as he always did. He gazed upwards at the visage of his ancestor, Senator Adrelis. It had been Adrelis who had received the scion's message. He had overseen the gate's construction and had helped them become a strongly respected member of the court. Genro reached into his vest and pulled an incense stick from it, one made from flowers native to Morlaw, as well as a small igniter pellet. He held both out to Relkis, who took them. Relkis placed the incense stick in a small hole at the base of the statue, between its feet. He held the igniter pellet to the upward end of the stick and pinched. A small pop and spark erupted between his fingers, and a thin tendril of smoke floated upwards. Relkis stepped back and bowed so deeply His horns nearly scraped the floor, still prostrating himself before he solemnly said,
"Guide me, Ancestor Adrelis, for tonight your counsel may very well be needed. For our honor, and for yours, I shall uphold our values. May I merit the honors you earned."
And then he stepped back, stood upright, squared his shoulders, and walked towards the court hall. As he walked, he saw many others doing as he had just done. It was custom for all in the empire, and so the large hallway smelled of 1,000 different flowers, of 1,000 different worlds. It was the only place in existence such an experience could be had, and it was truly beautiful. Relkis and Genro made it to the court hall as quickly as Genro's little legs could carry him. Relkis could have easily outpaced him, but that would be undue and poor form for a senator. Not to mention, Relkis enjoyed the little Telnian. Together, they entered the main chamber. It consisted of ring-shaped tables, all centered in the room around a large dais. The tables gradually increased in size to contain the previous table within. Many senators had already taken their places, seated at their planet's assigned spot. Relkis and Genro got to their spot, at a table about halfway from the dais in the center. Like the statues in the entryway, the order of assigned placements was dependent upon the order the species had joined the empire. As they took their seats, more and more senators and their attendants streamed in. It occurred to Relkis that the emperor may have summoned quite literally every senator. If he had, it would be the first time in Relkis's lifetime such a council had been called. The thought shook Relkis. This was far more serious than he had initially assumed. He and Genro waited patiently for the rest to find and take their places. They exchanged tense nods of acknowledgement with a few other representatives near them as they arrived. It seemed everyone was shaken by this summons and its implications. The humans have broken containment. Relkis recalled Genro's words. What could this mean? It was impossible, right? Relkis shook his head, knowing he would soon find out. A loud, deep note reverberated through the chamber, silencing everyone. Relkis looked up to see a massive disk of clay hanging at the end of the room. 2 Solern royal attendants were hitting it with large leather mallets. Another note sounded. A moment in silence passed, and then a third note rang through the room. The Solern attendants turned and stood stiff with their mallets raised to their sides. And then Relkis saw him. The Solern Emperor entered from behind the disk, and with quick strides took the dais in the center of the room. He turned and surveyed the Senate around him before speaking. "Senators, I have called this council to discuss grave developments. Some of you are familiar with this subject. Others may not have the slightest clue. To this end, let me speak and bring us all to the same page, so we may discuss how we wish to write the next. I called this council to discuss a species we have been observing. They call themselves the humans. They call their planet Earth and their solar system Sol. Their system lies on the edge of our territory." The Emperor paused to let the implications of this sink in. Relkis was familiar. The Empire had been keeping watch on these primates, gleaning information about them with their psionic reach. They had the potential to be candidates for joining the Empire, but they had yet to make peace among themselves. "We thought perhaps one day these humans could join us," the Emperor said coolly. He paused and then nearly whispered, "But they have broken evolutionary law." Shocked silence reigned in the chambers, as if everyone's breath had been pulled from them with that one assertion. "What do you mean, broken evolutionary law, my liege?" a senator called out. "A good and reasonable question. We know the evolutionary law states that a species will first tame themselves, making peace. Then they shall tame the existence particle, granting energy. Finally, they shall follow the Solern in constructing their gates, taming distance, and gaining unity. It is called law not because we enforce it, but because it has always been that way. It is law in the same way gravity is. It just is. The humans have done otherwise." An uproar nearly broke out, a cacophony of questions all cascading in. One in particular rang out from 100 throats. How? The Emperor let the question and shock permeate the room for a few moments, and then he silently raised one silvery hand. The chamber instantly calmed and went silent. We have been watching them, gleaning information from their minds when we can. We have, just this last night, learned horrific truths about them. The humans have had another war amongst themselves, fueled only by their disdain for each other's appearances and beliefs. This one consumed their entire planet. There is not a region of their world that has not been touched by this conflict. We have learned that in this war, they tamed the existential particle and weaponized it against each other. He stopped now, letting the last sentence hang in the air before continuing. That's right. Rather than turning this glorious gift of study into unlimited, renewable energy, they have chosen to unleash it upon each other. They dropped an explosive armed with existential particle on not one, but 2 of their cities. They did not target each other's armies, but instead their people, their citizens. These humans are obsessed with war. They have taken it to levels unheard of before among any sentient species. It is worth noting that with the distance to the human world, even with our most powerful scion leading the operation, there is still a large time delay in the information received. They are working as we speak to shorten this delay, so that we may better see this growing threat and make no mistake. These humans are a threat to us. If this is what they are willing to do to each other, to their own kind. He paused again, and an image was projected into the air above him. An image of a massive cloud, large and wide at the top, while thinner at the middle and the bottom. He then continued quietly. I fear to think what they will do to us, should they learn of our existence. The chambers were silent. Everyone stared at the projection in collective horror. None had ever imagined a species would bear so much lust for war and destruction that they would unleash this, let alone upon their own world and kind. Relkis struggled to not lose the last meal he had eaten. A senator at the back of the room stood and calmly asked, My lord, may we have more information on these humans? Their history and patterns, perhaps. We must see what we know so we may act on reason rather than fear, especially with a time delay on the information we receive. The Emperor turned and said, Of course. There is another issue at play here as well. I have one of our lead researchers here to brief you all. He then stepped down from the dais and went to his seat, situated closest to the dais, signifying his planet's position as founders of the Empire. One of the Solern Scion attendants walked forward and took the dais. Greetings, honorable senators, they said with a bow. We have what we believe to be an accurate account of the humans' history up to the news the Emperor has delivered. They are the youngest species we have encountered, by far the youngest to have ever tamed the existential particle. Their species, by their own accounts, only evolved around 300,000 of their Earth's, their planet's, years, or revolutions, around their star. The Senate went into an uproar once again, everyone shocked. No species had advanced their sciences far enough in such a short time to be able to manipulate, let alone detect the existential particles. How is this possible? Was the prevailing question, asked by fearful voices throughout the room. The Emperor stood and yelled, I demand silence! We shall have order in these meetings or we shall not have them. The room became still immediately. The threat of ending the session hung in the air like a hammer, prepared to strike the room down. It couldn't mean the Emperor thought this serious enough to declare war, could it? Relkis thought to himself. The Scion researcher cleared their throat and continued. Yes, they have advanced that quickly. From what we can tell, their growth and rapid scientific acceleration has been spurred on by one single motivating factor, war. Time and time again, throughout their history, they have repeated one cycle. Advancement leads to prosperity. Prosperity leads to competition. Competition leads to war. And war leads to advancement. From their most primitive days, they have done this. It is a pattern they have never broken from yet. Senator, you ask what the human pattern to learn from is. Well, that is it. Now the other issue at play our Emperor mentioned. The humans have achieved space travel. They have created large combustion rockets that they strap themselves into and ride into the Great Void. This, too, is unheard of. They have landed on their moon and successfully returned to their planet. They have escaped the natural containment of their world. The room was deadly quiet now. To learn that a species had advanced itself so quickly by destroying each other was a horrific thought. Evolution and advancement were meant to be fueled by peace and shared growth of knowledge. The thought of these humans having been candidates for the Empire chilled Relkus to the bone. He stood and declared,
We cannot let them join us. We cannot allow them the gate technology. They must be contained to their own system.
Roars of agreement shook the room. Relkus sat back down and felt a tug on the hem of his robe. Genro was there with a cloth in hand. He leaned in closely to Relkus and whispered, My lord, your brow. Relkus realized the revelations about the humans and the image that still hung in the air had caused him to begin perspiring in fear. He took the cloth and wiped his face. As he finished, he saw the Emperor stand and walk to the dais. He stood next to the Scion and turned to survey the room. I see that the same fear which grips me now has all of you in its hold as well. This is good and reasonable, given what we know. But Senator Relkus is right. So long as none share the gate technology with the humans, so long as the humans never learn of us, we will hopefully be fine. Let them war amongst themselves. Perhaps in a few 100,000 more of their years, they will have learned peace, or perhaps they will have immolated themselves completely in the fires of war, or perhaps they will continue to master the Great Void, and they will arrive here. He stopped and shook his head, his shoulders sagging. The Scion researcher gently placed a hand on the Emperor's shoulder, and then stepped down and walked away. He sighed and said, But I do not wish to do nothing. The possibility of this threat is too great. Some form of agency must be taken. I submit now new laws regarding the humans. In summary, it shall be outlawed to contact the humans without express consent of the entire sitting Senate. It shall be outlawed to observe the humans, unless authorized and overseen directly by the Senate, Emperor, and head of the Scions. It shall be outlawed to establish new member species that may be discovered within 1,000 light-years of the human system. A large number of senators began loudly protesting the last declaration, all clamoring over each other. Relkus was not among them. He could see the Emperor's reasoning. If they established new members too close to the humans, they risked discovery. If the humans learned of them, or worse, of the gates, by observing a new member species constructing theirs, it could spell destruction for everyone. As it stood now, gate travel was impossible without assistance from the Scions, but the humans' rate of advancement brought with it the possibility of them altering that. It was a lot of ifs, but the humans were terrifying. Those ifs might be the Empire's only safeguards, especially when considering that the humans were riding rockets into the void. The Emperor let the senators voice their objections before addressing them all at once. I understand. This does limit and potentially punish members yet to be discovered. However, these humans pose far too great a threat. We cannot risk it. We must look elsewhere for new species to join us. These laws will be voted on, and if they are not passed, I shall respect it. We decide our fate together. That is the whole point of this empire. As he finished, small interface monitors slid up from the tables in front of each senator. It was time to vote on these proposed policies. Relkus voted in favor of all three provisions, hit the double confirmation on each, and then waited for the rest of the council to vote. He looked around the room and saw many senators discussing quietly with their attendants. The Telnian attendants always shone in moments like this. They had a way of helping you parse difficult thoughts just by talking them through with you. It was why their species had elected to serve as attendants rather than having a seat in the Senate themselves. It seemed this vote was not as easy for the other senators. This made sense to Relkus. After all, his species was one of the only that still had records of their wars. He was one of the few whose families had made their way into prominence through it. He was one of the few who still felt guilt for the actions of some of his ancestors. He would do anything to restore their honor, even if it meant blocking some new species from joining. It took a while, but eventually every senator had voted. When the votes had been counted and double-checked, the emperor stood and took the dais again. He once again slowly turned on the dais to make sure he took in every senator there before saying, "The vote stands as follows. The first and second proposed laws have been approved, and they are effective immediately. There will be a zero-tolerance policy on these, with strict enforcement. The third law was approved on a provisional basis by a narrow margin. It shall only go into effect should a state of emergency or war be declared by the standing emperor. Stars forbid we ever reach that point." The emperor turned and looked out in Relkis's direction and said, "I now ask for volunteers. I wish a special task committee to be formed for us to create contingency plans. Who among you would be a part of it? I ask to be included in proceedings, yet I believe it would be best if led by one who knows of war. Senator Relkis, I ask you to take the lead on this. I know you have just as much interest in keeping the Empire at peace as I do. Will you do this for me?" Relkis was shocked. He had never been singled out by the Emperor before, nor did he realize the Emperor understood his motivations so well. He cast a glance at Genro, who nodded once. Relkis stood and addressed the chambers. "You honor my ancestors and myself. I accept this task. Who will join me, so that should the worst come to pass, we may be prepared to secure peace?" The room was still and silent, and for a moment, Relkis thought none would volunteer. Then, the Relsinki senator rose from his spot. He was a large purple gelatinous mass, as all of his species were. Shortly after, a small bipedal feather-winged senator of the summon rose as well. They were other senators whose species had documented their conflicts. Relkis nodded his approval. These were the perfect senators for the job. They understood the need to avoid a conflict with the humans just as well as he did. "We shall get the job done, my emperor," Relkis said with a bow. Those who volunteered bowed as well. "I could not have asked for more. Thank you, senators, for your time today. If there is nothing else that needs to be discussed with urgency, the session is over. Those of you on this new task, please stay so we may discuss that further." "My liege, urgent news!" A scion burst into the room, cutting the emperor off. "Well then, what is it?" the emperor said crisply. "We have made a grave mistake. The information we had previously was about 24 of their Earth years behind. As you know, we had been looking into ways to gain more up-to-date information. We attempted one, and we believed it was promising. We used what the humans call radio waves to amplify our own psionic signals. We heard news broadcasts from the human year 1977, the most recent we've been able to yet." The scion paused, now looking nervous. "And?" the emperor demanded. "The humans detected us. They know of us now," the scion said meekly. "What was the human response? How much do they know? Will they bring war to us?" The emperor railed the questions off with authority. "We do not know, sir. As soon as we learned they had detected us, we ceased all signals," the scion said, cowering. Relkis knew the emperor would not harm the scion. He was too kind to harm the messenger, but he still empathized with the scion's plight in delivering such grave news. Relkis felt his legs wobble, and he fell into his chair stunned. The humans, who had unleashed the fury of existence onto each other, who had built and ridden explosive rockets into the great void, the humans who had broken every pattern but war, knew about them. Relkis felt the fear perspiration from before return, much worse this time. He mopped his brow with the cloth Genro had provided before. The pressure of his new task and role leading it doubled down. He felt the weight of it and the fear of the humans crushing him. Genro placed a hand on his arm, and he felt himself pull together. As long as his faithful attendant was there by his side, helping share the weight, he knew he could handle it. The rest of the chambers were filled with open fear and panic. Many of the senators from species nearer the human systems were the loudest. The emperor again raised a hand, silencing them. "I understand your fears. They are mine as well. I propose we begin resettlement efforts in advance for those who wish to. We cannot abandon our people to this risk," he said. This calmed much of the panic. Relkis stood and looked out over his fellow senators and to the emperor. The emperor motioned for him to come forward and stand beside him. Apprehension gripped Relkis. as he walked to the dais. Was he really going to commit the same sins as his ancestors? Could he bring himself to once again open the forges and begin building the weapons of war? And then he was on the dais, standing next to the Emperor.
My colleagues and Emperor, I believe we must face a grave truth. We have never before faced a threat from the stars like this. We have faced many great challenges and seen each other through them. I see no reason this will be any different. We must strive for peace where we can, yet we must also be prepared for the lust they hold for war. We must work together, leveraging the advantages of every member species to build defenses against these human rockets. They may come through the Great Void after us. This is a possibility we cannot ignore. But if they do, they will find us ready and waiting. If the humans' love of war should find us, we will not be found wanting.